Thank you, General, for joining us, for giving us your time. This is a very special session because space is everywhere. You know, space is a certain mystery. It has a mystique, and yet we all think of it in abstract terms. Our lives are being transformed from our daily communications to the way we are fighting wars, and it is the geopolitics of terra firma is being in some ways replicated in space, and the aspirations of a number of countries are now to become, if they are not already, players in space. Space is being militarized. Space is also being corporatized. So in a sense, this is a discussion that involves multiple dimensions, and to talk about it, to talk about space power, its implications for American policy, its implications for the rest of the world, the consequences that follow through, and the way battles are being fought. We have General Whiting, Commander, US Space Command, to talk about a range of things, whatever time we have. So the first question, which is, for many in the audience, as I said, it might look very abstract to talk about space. Can you elaborate a bit on how this idea of space has transformed itself from merely a scientific question to an operational question which impinges our daily lives? And in particular, how is it impacting the national security discourse and its operationalization in contemporary context?
Well, thank you, Harsh, and I want to thank ORF for inviting me to be here at Rasina. It's my first trip to India, and it's been extraordinary, several days here that we've had. And I really look forward to the dialogue here this evening. You know, it strikes me with your question that the space age is not even 70 years old yet. And there's probably people in this room who were born before the space age began. And now, as we sit in 2026, space has become foundational to our lives, to our economy, and yes, to the way we defend our nations. Certainly, our economies have become dependent on space in a way that allows us to truly be global, to be untethered from global networks. We can be out on an oil rig in the middle of the ocean. We can be high in the Himalayas. We could be in a desert somewhere, and we still expect today, and we can deliver broadband internet, which is great for commerce, but it also enables healthcare, it enables education, it enables services to far-flung communities all around the world. And so that's foundational to our society, and we don't want to back up and go back to a pre-space age where we don't have those capabilities. In fact, there was an estimate recently that the space economy is worth somewhere close to $600 billion today, and that in the next several years that will likely trip over $1 trillion. So it's just a critical part of our overall economy. But perhaps more importantly to my line of work, it's critical to how we defend our nations. In the United States, we've spent 35 years learning how and figuring out how to execute operations in what we call a multi-domain fashion. That means when our Air Force, our Army, our Navy, our Marine Corps are operating, they operate with an assumption that they will have space capabilities. Things like satellite communications, global positioning, missile warning, as well as cyber capabilities. And all of that has to operate together. And we could not defend ourselves the way we did in World War II, for example, because we don't have the force structure, nor the numbers of capabilities and equipment that we had back then, because today we're much more precise, lethal, and far-ranging because of our space capabilities. So it's absolutely foundational to how we defend our country, and because of that, we must defend those space capabilities to make sure that we don't lose them.
So in terms of, if you can also give this audience some concrete examples of recent conflicts where space has been an enabler in the way conflicts are being fought, and in the way, as commanders, you are conceptualizing those conflicts.
Well, in the United States way of operating, which is, again, all-domain maneuver warfare, space is a foundational, fully integrated part of that. And as our chairman of the Joint Chiefs has highlighted in recent days and weeks, all of our U.S. military operations, including the most recent, have space capabilities completely integrated and layered in. Not only does that provide overwatch for our terrestrial forces, but it also provides us unique accesses and ways to open up their ability to operate early in a campaign. So I'm very proud of those capabilities and how we are fully a part of that planning and integration and operations process.
General, one theme that we continue to hear is that space is becoming congested, competitive, etc. From an operational point of view, what out of this, what does concern you most when you look at the dangers and the challenges that you face?
Yeah, what concerns me the most would be another C word, that it's contested today. And we have seen a number of international actors, such as China and Russia, move breathtakingly fast in space. You know, there are reports that Russia might be considering an anti-satellite weapon that they would place on orbit with a nuclear payload that would violate the Outer Space Treaty, and it would be an incredibly indiscriminate weapon. It would not precisely attack one country's capabilities. It would attack all countries' capabilities, whether that's the United States, India, Japan, Europe, China, and so we do not want to see that happen and would not be able to tolerate that. China also has moved breathtakingly fast. They have developed a suite of counter-space weapons, everything from reversible jammers to hold at risk our satellite communications and GPS, to high-energy lasers, direct-descent ASAT weapons, and even what we call co-orbital ASAT weapons. Those are satellites that can attack other satellites. And so those capabilities have been built for a reason, and of course we want to make sure that conflict does not begin in space or extend into space, and so we've got to watch that very carefully.
So General, is there a tipping point here, or you know, when you think of space as a contested domain, is it still a calibration between competition and cooperation, or have we tipped in one side, especially on the contestation side, as you point out? Are we there yet, or are you waiting for the tipping point to happen?
Well, I think in any domain, anywhere around the world, it is a balance of both. Now, space was birthed in great power competition. If you go back to 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, that was all about who was going to get to space first, and frankly, the Soviet Union won those early opening chapters. They launched the first object, they launched the first animal, the first man, the first woman, and that created a crisis of confidence in my nation, and in response to that, we created NASA. We really accelerated our space program, and ultimately Neil Armstrong walked out onto the lunar surface in 1969, closing their space race, which the United States won. And even up to today, we've seen that it is a place that great powers are competing, but it's an incredible area for cooperation as well. We've seen that over the years, and certainly in the United States, we have a rich number of partners and allies that we operate together in space. Perhaps that's represented by the Artemis Accords, which is a NASA-led effort to have countries sign up to a series of principles about how we want to operate in space. And India is a signatory to that as well. And certainly on the military side, we have various groupings of partner nations that we work with at the closest level, and then to maybe new entrants into space. And we have dozens of countries that we work with to help them facilitate their space capability, and together to show that an attack on one would affect us all, and to help promote deterrence.
General, just continuing this conversation on the war-fighting domain itself, do concepts like deterrence and escalation lend themselves easily to this domain, or is there a fundamental ambiguity here that war-fighters test when you have a very contested space, and then you have to navigate that balance between how do you look at the adversary and a prospective partner?
That's a great question, Harsh, and something we think a lot about, because we don't have the centuries and millennia of experience that you have in land warfare or naval warfare, or even a century of experience in air warfare. We've never fought a war in space, and we don't want to fight a war in space. That, again, is not inevitable, and we want to deter that from happening. We want space to remain a place that nations can go for economic development, for scientific discovery, for exploration, and yes, to help defend themselves without hindrance from others. But we think a lot about deterrence and escalation, and I think the classical elements of deterrence still hold. Number one, you have to clearly communicate what it is you're trying to deter. Number two, you have to demonstrate to a potential opponent that if they were to attack you, in my case in space, that we're going to deny them the benefit of that attack. And then additionally, that if they were to attack us, that there are costs that they're going to face. And then that calculus comes together to cause them to be deterred from acting against us. We think that still holds, But the question is, what is it that you're deterring? And so we have to be clear about that as we signal to potential opponents. And yes, escalation is something that we also have to be concerned about. If there is a war here on terra firma, as you mentioned a moment ago, how do activities in space affect that, those operations, and how could they potentially either lead to escalation or de-escalation? Again, those are the kind of issues that we have officers and staff colleges and war colleges thinking deeply about, so that we can try to come to those understandings without the experience that other domains may have.
Two aspects here, General, if you can reflect upon. One is, can we in the present context of great power fragmentation and the deterioration of the multilateral order, is there scope for any arms control arrangement to work under the present circumstances in space? Because we know the one that exists no longer is very effective. Taking from that, would the US be leading some of that effort, or is it something that emerging powers like India, for example, who are not part of this geopolitical contestation, also have a role in shaping and forming?
Well, I would point us to the existing agreements and treaties we have today. Let's start there. We have the Outer Space Treaty, and as I noted a moment ago, it says no country should put a weapon of mass destruction in space. And we would like to see all signatories to that adhere to it strictly. I'll leave it to our diplomats to talk about whether we want to proceed with additional arms control treaties. But I'll just say that when countries like Russia puts forward a treaty proposal, and yet they're developing counterspace weapons, it seems like it's not a serious proposal that they're making. And so we want to see the actions that are pointing in that direction before I think we would want to consider any kind of additional treaty obligations at this point.
And how about the two aspects here, which I think which are very relevant to this conversation, which is one which I mentioned at the beginning, the entry of private sector in space. How does it impact military? Is militaries operating there? It can be, there are certain positives, there are certain negatives. How do you evaluate them? And the other is this emerging tech. How do you, when you think of military operating in space, how do you integrate AI, automation, large constellations? I mean, is there a way to integrate them and to think about it holistically, or are we looking at it, in silos?
There's a lot in that question, so
yes, there are two questions.
I'll approach. Let me answer, and then you come back and get what I missed here. But I like to call this the second golden age of space. The first golden age being that first decade or 12 years culminating with Neil Armstrong walking out on the lunar surface. The entire world was captured and captivated by that activity. And now we've entered a world, and that was led by governments. Today we've entered a world where it's equally exciting. We take for granted now that rockets can land, and a decade ago that would have been absolute science fiction. And now we're in a second generation of those rockets, and that's all being led by commercial industry. So this is an incredibly exciting time, and certainly those of us in the national security sector want to be able to take advantage of those innovations, take advantage of the reduced costs that we've seen. But it does, it opens up questions now about how do we best leverage that, how can we best capture those cost savings, and then operate safely in that domain with so many more commercial actors. Interestingly, in the last couple of days, I've had a chance to meet with Indian commercial space companies as well. And there's truly a growing ecosystem here in India of commercial space capabilities. And they've been very sophisticated, and they've figured out how to operate in the United States, and so we're taking advantage of some of those companies. And I think it behooves all nations to figure out how to take advantage of those rich commercial innovations that are occurring right now.
One aspect which I think applies to both US and India, we are two democracies. How difficult it is to balance transparency and deterrence when it comes to space operations, because ultimately it's also a question of signaling to your partners and to your adversaries both at the same time. Do democracies face a particular challenge here, or is it the same for everyone?
I think democracies do have a challenge when we live in open, transparent societies, but it's also an advantage because we're not trying to direct everything from the top down. We're allowing bottoms-up innovation from commercial industry. And so, that's a real benefit for us. And we think, again, we've got to continue to take advantage of that.
General, how are you thinking of partnerships? And here I would also, of course, you are here to talk about, to talk with your Indian counterparts about this space partnership that was envisaged last year between the two nations. Where do you think the most potential lies, and how do you envision the architecture of that partnership emerge?
Yeah, it's been great this week to meet with a number of senior defense officials here in India, as well as the Ministry of External Affairs. We've also had a chance to meet with ISRO and really have been excited about hearing about their plans to launch Indian astronauts here from India in the next 18 months or so. But the real progress that we're trying to make with our defense colleagues is to build on the 10-year security framework that the Minister of Defense here in India, Minister Singh, and then the Secretary of War, Secretary Hegseth from the United States, signed late last year. And it calls out a number of areas where we want to continue to deepen the strategic partnership, and space is one of those. And we think maybe the richest area for ongoing cooperation is to improve our ability to share space situational awareness data. Everything we do in space rests on a foundation of good awareness of what's happening in the domain. That's tracking the almost 50,000 pieces of trackable objects that we can track on orbit, and that number has gone up very, very fast in the last several years, but also to better understanding intentions of others. And so we had good discussions with our Indian colleagues about ways that we can shape agreements and then start to work together to build interoperability in our tactics, techniques, and procedures to gain a better shared understanding of space.
So since we are, we have the last few minutes left, General, if you look to the future, what kind of transformations do you see in space over the next, say, the scale and speed of change is so fast that I think we need to look not a decadal, but almost a 5-year orbit. How do you evaluate the transformation? What kind of transformations you feel, from a military point of view, would be most significant for fighting battles or fighting wars, and also managing national security?
There's an interesting historical analogy that we'll have to see exactly how this plays out, but if we go back into ancient times when societies, countries, nations started trading on the oceans, we had to figure out the technology of how to do long-range navigation at sea, and then we figured out, oh, there's a commercial opportunity here, and we started trading together. Well, then piracy stepped in, and other nations would try to interfere with that trade, and eventually that drove a need for what we call blue water navies that could follow those lines of communications and to secure them so that a country's trade could flow freely, and a nation then could become prosperous based on that trade. In the next decade, we are going to see just an incredible expansion of space for economic purposes. Many of you have been reading over the last 6 months. Now we have AI companies talking about going to space to put their AI data centers on orbit. We could see tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of satellites. We have commercial companies who are going to go to the moon and exploit its resources, go to the asteroids, perhaps go to Mars. And we're going to have to see, will the naval analogy hold? Will there become things like piracy? Will there become nations interfering with those lines of commerce and communication? And if so, we're going to have a defense capability that's not just focused on planet Earth. Today, that's my concern, is ensuring that I can help defend the United States, help our joint force be successful in operations, help our allies and partners. But there may come a time when we also have to think about securing those lines of communication, securing economic activity on the moon, on the asteroids. And if that happens, that could happen very, very quickly, given the pace of change that we're seeing at this point.
So when it comes to you talked about arms control and how that is that no longer is perhaps most effective given the geopolitical contestation. In terms of just framing the norms and the rules of the road for the future, are you optimistic that you have we live in a world of like-minded coalition partners? Countries are no longer looking at big multilateral alliances, but small coalitions of the willing. Are you optimistic that there are enough countries which would be willing to look at some of these normative standards being set? Because increasingly this will be a question between regulation and exploitation. How much Do you allow corporate sector to go into space? What kind of regulatory frameworks are needed? Is there enough consensus you find in the general discourse or in the General Committee of Nations, or is this still a very nascent conversation that we are beginning to happen?
I am optimistic. You know, in the United States, we care so deeply about preserving space as a safe place for all countries to operate that you may be interested to know that we have a couple units, space units, that each and every day they track every active satellite from any country on Earth, whether that's India, the United States, China, Russia, Japan, Europe, and they perform what we call conjunction assessments, where they predict those orbits over the next 24 hours and see if any of those active satellites are going to run into one of these tens of thousands of pieces of debris. And if we see that that's going to happen, we send a notification out to the owner of that satellite so that they can maneuver, if they're able to do that, and not create more debris by hitting a piece of debris. And as we work harsh with our allies and partners, most countries absolutely understand it's in their interest to be a professional, safe actor on orbit, because we all want to preserve the opportunity in space, not only for our nations today, but for our children and for future generations that are coming. And we see that with the Artemis Accords. Dozens of nations have signed up to these principles. And certainly in the United States, you know, we want all nations to be safe and responsible actors. But if we see countries that aren't, when most of us are, it helps stand out when those countries choose not to act in a safe and responsible way. And the more congested space gets, the more important this will become going forward.
So generally, if you were supposed to leave the policymakers with one recommendation to ensure long-term stability in space, what would that be, given the present context?
That's an interesting question.
Yes, I know there are many possibilities, but if you can think of a few, because I think in some ways the idea is that, you know, what all of the discussion that we have had, given the contestation, competition, and congestion, there is and the inability of the multilateral order to sort of respond to that. You still, you know, when in your last message, you were very confident and optimistic about the possibility that countries would be willing to work together. So in that space, if we have to continue to take that conversation forward, are there one or two things that you think policymakers, particularly in India or in the US, need to take forward in terms of their policy response to a very, very difficult environment that we find ourselves in?
Thank you, Harsh. You know, space is not a domain that just because you don't see it every day that you can choose to ignore. And I think any country that does that will do that at their peril, especially large countries like India and the United States, with so many interests and equities that are tied up in space. And I do think that the transparency of our democratic nations and our institutions is ultimately a plus for us. Yes, there'll be things that we won't talk about publicly, like in any domain, that are critical to the national defense. But I think for our countries, the more transparent we can be, I think it helps point out those countries that choose not to be transparent, and those countries who, you know, their public actions or public statements are different than their private actions, because they try to keep that opaque from us. So I do think transparency is a very positive step, and then not ignoring space as a you know, fundamental area of national concern.
As we conclude, General, just final word on US-India cooperation, and when you look at the future, what are 2 or 3 things that you want India and US to do together in the realm of space?
Well, it's been so great to be here this week, and we just see the importance of the US-India strategic partnership each and every day. And certainly, I think India understands that it has requirements in space and that there are areas that we can partner together. I mentioned the space situational awareness data sharing earlier and how important that is. We think there's opportunities to collaborate on exercises. We think there's ways to have our technical experts have discussions and interchanges so we can learn from each other on doctrine, on training, on education. And we're excited to move all those forward. And certainly my discussions this week, I found receptive interlocutors on the Indian side who also want to move those areas forward. So we're excited to see how this proceeds, given the direction that our two, the Minister and the Secretary, have given us to make progress in this area.
Thank you, General. Thank you for your comments, and thank you for being so optimistic about both the space and how that domain is evolving, and also U.S.-India partnership. We wish you all the luck and good luck with your work, both as a commander of in the U.S. Space Command, as well as India, taking the U.S.-India space partnership forward. So good luck and thank you so much.
Thank you, Harsh.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon.